Brilliant. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and happy World Bee Day. It's lovely to have a day a year devoted to celebrating the 20,000 species of bees that we have globally. Thank you very much to Pranjali and to all at Burren for the invitation this evening. And when I got the invite, I thought, oh, wow, that'll be easy. I'll just throw together 10 things and that'll be straightforward. But actually, when it came to it, I realized it's actually quite difficult to pick your top 10. So we have 99 species of bees in Ireland, and we have over 800 species of plants, the vast majority of which are visited by bees and other pollinators. So it was actually quite a tough decision to pull out just a few. So as a result, I took my inspiration from findings from two recent projects that have taken place in my lab. So on the left is Michelle Larkin. So I'm going to draw on some of her work tonight. And Michelle has just finished her PhD, where she was looking at pollinators in the Burren, and she was working closely with the Burren program as well, which was fantastic. And on the right, there is Niamh Phelan, and Niamh has just finished her MSc project in my lab, and she was working on the Mullet Peninsula in County Mayo, looking at some rare pollinators there. So I have 5 bees and 5 plants for you tonight, inspired by the work of these two. So the first, starting with the bees, because it is World Bee Day, and these are in no particular order, so I haven't ranked them from 1 to 5, so don't think I have strong preferences within these 5. But my number 1 that I want to share with you tonight is this. This is the shrill carder bee, Bombus sylvarum. And this is one of our 21 bumblebee species that we have in Ireland. But this species is endangered in an Irish context. And I saw it first in Roscommon. It was probably about 10 years ago now. Since that time, it hasn't been seen much in Roscommon because the stronghold for this bee is now the Burren region. And it's not just the Irish stronghold for this bee, it's actually the stronghold of Ireland and Great Britain. So if there was to be a postcard bee in the Burren, it should probably be this. I'm very proud of this picture. I took it obviously just after some rain. You can see the raindrops in the flower there. And this poor individual was very cold and wet and therefore wasn't moving very fast. So it was easy to take a picture of her there. And it's a beautiful bee. It kind of has these gray, greenish stripes and a characteristic red tail. And as the name suggests, it has a very shrill buzz. So often you hear this bee before you actually see it. So second on my list of 5 bees is this. This is the great yellow bumblebee, Bombastist in Gwendos, another one of our 21 bumblebee species. And this is a species that Niamh worked on for her MSc project. But you might remember that I said Niamh was working on the Mullet Peninsula and not in the Burren. And that's because unfortunately this bee, it was formerly found widespread in Ireland. It was formerly found in the Burren. I saw it in the Burren in 2010. But since that time, it seems to have declined in its range even further. And nationwide, it's now only found really in a healthy population in the Mullet Peninsula that Niamh was studying. However, the Burren does seem like an ideal habitat for this species, so we wouldn't be surprised if there was some relic populations still active there. So my message to all of you tonight is keep your eyes peeled. If you see this, we like to call it a blonde bombshell of a bee. It's got this beautiful blonde hair, but it has this characteristic black stripe on its thorax, which is the key feature of this bee. So if you spot something like this, take a photograph and it could be an interesting find for the Burren. So the third bee species on my list is this, the white-tailed bumblebee, Bombus lucorum. So my partner is a musician. He's a long-suffering partner because he knows way more about bees than he ever cared to know about. And when I said I was doing this talk tonight, he asked me, was I going to select Bombus lucorum for the sheer workhorse that it is. And he's not wrong. So in Michelle's work, she found that Bombus lucorum was the most abundant bumblebee that she found in some of her studies in the Burren. So it's a very commonly found bumblebee. And it visits a wide variety of different flowers. So it's probably one of the most frequently seen bees. It's got those lovely yellow and black stripes and a very bright white tail. It's an interesting species because it's actually a grouping of species that look very similar. So we can't really distinguish them in the field. So we call this kind of a species group, but Bombus lucorum is generally the most common one. In the corner of this slide, I also have the red-tailed bumblebee, just to mention, because that was the other most commonly found bumblebee in Michelle's work in the Burren. Okay, but not all of our bumblebee, sorry, not all of our bee species are social like bumblebees and honeybees. 77 of the bee species that we have in Ireland are in fact solitary bees. So as their name suggests, they don't live in colonies like bumblebees and honeybees, that each individual female builds her own nest. So I picked this bee, the Slender Mining Bee. It's in the genus Lassie, and we have about 11 Lassie species in Ireland. But this was the most commonly found solitary bee in the Burren in Michelle's work. So the graph, I'm only showing you one graph this evening. The graph on the right-hand side there shows the solitary bee species that Michelle found. Now, she didn't actually find that many solitary bee species in the Burren, and we think this might be because the Burren has obviously a lot of rock and has soils that might be harder for bees to nest in, or it could be because of the west of Ireland, their weather conditions aren't so good for bees that like sunny, warm, dry conditions. But anyway, this is Lassie calceatum, the slender mining bee, which is the most commonly found bee by Michelle. It's a lovely bee. It has these really nice hair stripes on its abdomen, and there's lovely kind of brown hairs on its back leg, which are its main characteristics. So it's quite a generalist species. It forages on a lot of different plants, and it's found from between March and September. Okay, so the fifth bee that I've chosen is also a solitary bee. This time it's in the genus Andrena. We have 26 species of Andrena in Ireland, but this is the small scabious mining bee, Andrena marginata. And this species is critically endangered in Ireland. It may in fact even be extinct in Ireland, but the reason I have selected it tonight is because on the data centre records, the only record of the species since 2017 is in fact from the Burren. So if this species is to be found anywhere, the Burren is a likely spot. So it's, as its name suggests, it's a specialist species, and it specializes on scabious, devil's bit scabious, field scabious, and so on. So you can see why the Burren would be a good habitat for it. Again, it's quite a beautiful looking bee. It's got that lovely orange abdomen. Yeah, it's a really nice photograph there from Stephen Falk. Okay, so they are the 5 bees that I've chosen for tonight. So moving on to the 5 plants. So really, you can't talk about bees without mentioning this plant, and this is common knapweed Centuria nigra, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. But this species is particularly good for bees. So in Michelle's work, she found that all the bumblebee species that she found in the Burren, she also saw them foraging on this plant. And in Niamh's work, she found that 28% of all of the bumblebee visits she saw were also to this plant. So it's a super plant for bumblebees, but it's also a super plant for some butterfly species as well. So it's obviously late flowering. So it's not useful for bees when they're establishing their colonies, but it's there later on in the season. And you can see in that second picture on the right there, that's a Bombus lapidarius. And you can see its big pollen sacs on the back of its legs. So it's collecting loads of pollen from knapweed to bring back to feed to its developing larvae. Okay, the second plant that I've chosen tonight is a red clover, Trifolium pratense. I'm sure it's very familiar to a lot of you. And red clover, Nia found in her work, was the second most important plant for the great yellow bumblebee, Bombastist and Gwendos. And Michelle also found it used by bumblebees in her work. But red clover is an interesting plant because it does produce lots of nectar and pollen. But if you look, you can see this is kind of a flower head, and all those, it's made up of little individual florets. So you can probably see them individually there, but you'll see each one is a tube, and the tube is actually quite long. So the nectar is at the very base of that tube. So it's only bees that have tongues long enough to be able to get the nectar can actually forage on this plant. And on the right-hand side there, you'll see the same photo I showed you before of the great yellow bumblebee, but you'll see its tongue is extended, and it is a species that has quite a long tongue. So it's actually able to access the nectar in red clover. So red clover is a fantastic plant for bumblebees, but only the species that have a tongue long enough to be able to access it. Okay, my third plant this evening is rough hawkbit, Leontodon hispidus. Again, a plant commonly found in the Burren. Apologies, the photo on the left I don't think is rough hawkbit, but the photo on the right is. And you can see it's got this characteristic white hairs on it, which is one of the key features. But rough hawkbit is a very important plant, not just for bumblebees, as you can see in the picture here, but also for solitary bee species. So 3 of the 4 solitary bee species that Michelle saw in her work in the Burren were foraging on this plant. So unlike a red clover that I showed you earlier on that has those really long floral tubes, in rough hawkbit, the nectar and pollen, it's really easily accessible. So solitary bees with short tongues and flies, hoverflies, for example, are able to access the nectar very easily in this plant. Number 4 on my list tonight is Buttercup. Ranunculus species. We have a number of different buttercup species in Ireland: Ranunculus repens, Ranunculus acris. If there's any farmers here tonight, you might be thinking, what is she doing selecting buttercups? But buttercups are, again, like rough hawkbit, they're quite open flowers and they have lots of nectar and lots of pollen. And as a result, because they're so open, they're really good, again, for solitary bees, as pictured here, and also for hoverflies. So again, in Michelle's work, she found that half of all of the solitary bees she saw were visiting buttercups, and she also found they were very important for hoverflies. So they are quite beautiful flowers. I don't know if any of you have ever held them under your chin when you were a child to see whether you like butter or not, but also very good for some of our smaller bees and other pollinators. And then finally tonight, I felt I couldn't do a talk about bees and flowers without mentioning this beautiful flower, which really combines stories about both, which again is commonly found in the Burren. So this, a lot of you are probably very familiar with this plant. If you haven't seen it in person, I really hope you can get out and see it this summer. It's such a strikingly beautiful flower when you see it in person. This is the Bee Orchid, Ophrys epifera. So the Bee Orchid, it has evolved this system of mimicry where the flower has evolved to look and smell, more importantly, quite like a female bee. So to you and I, it might look fairly subtle, the resemblance is there, but if you are a male bee of the right species, this looks very, very attractive. So attractive that you in fact come along and try and mate with this flower. Because it smells good and looks like a female bee. So when the male bees try and mate with the flower, they pick up the pollinia or the pollen packets on the back of their head. And then when they get fooled by the next bee orchid, they deposit the pollen on it. So it's a very, very clever system of attracting its pollinators. Now, actually, the bees that have evolved this relationship with the bee orchid, we don't actually have them in Ireland. They're found mainly in the southern range of this plant elsewhere in Europe. So in Ireland, this orchid mainly self-pollinates, but it's just a fantastic example of the co-evolution between orchids and bees. Okay, so that was a whirlwind tour through my top 5 bees and top 5 plants in the Burren, and a little bit of a story associated with both. And thanks again to Michelle and to Niamh for giving me some of the inspiration tonight. And thanks again for the invitation, and to you all for listening.
Dara, thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing as always. I just think the identification is all about the tail, and it looks so incredibly hard. So you spend a lot of time looking at bees' bottoms. So there's just a couple of questions if we've got time for you, Dara. Just 2 now, I should say as well, we've got 162 people online or listening in now, so thank you ever so much for joining us all. First of all, Dara, what do mining bees mine for? So that's from Anya and Ben in Clough, Jordan.
Okay, I think the name mining bee comes from actually their nesting habitat. So the vast majority of our solitary bees actually nest in the ground. So they dig holes, usually in kind of south-facing dry banks. They actually dig their nests into the ground. So I think that's where the mining term comes from. There are some species that also are cavity nesters. So they nest sometimes in walls or sometimes in cavities of stems of plants and so on and so forth. But yeah, most of our solitary bees in Ireland are in fact ground nesting.
Fabulous, not coal miners or anything like that. And then our second question from Moira, how many of our bumblebee species have a long tongue?
Okay, so I'd have to list them for you, Moira. Okay, so things like the garden bumblebee, the great yellow bumblebee, the shrill carder bee, the common carder bee, the Bombus muscorum, which is the forgotten the common name. They would be our kind of longest tongued bees. Then something like the early bumblebee is kind of a medium tongue, and then things like the red-tailed bumblebee, the white-tailed bumblebee, are shorter tongued. So sorry, I don't have the proportions off the top of my head, but it is a good mixture. And generally the long-tongued bees can visit flowers with long tubes and short tubes, but the short-tongued bees are limited only to the flowers with the shorter tubes.
Brilliant, Dara, thank you so much. There are more questions, but we better move on. We don't want to run over time or Pranjali will kill me. So,
I just want to say, Dara, if you guys have questions for Dara, she might, if she's willing to hang around for a little bit, she might type answers back to you if you put those questions in the Q&A section. Yeah,
fabulous. Good idea, Pranjali. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, thank you everyone for joining us tonight, for watching us. So Dara, that was just amazing. I'm always stunned with how many different types of bee there are, and they're so small we don't really notice there's that many different types. So that was a really lovely start, especially on Bee Day.
Okay, so can people see my screen?
Yeah, very good, thanks.
Okay, so I'll just, maybe if for those who want to stick around for 20 minutes, I'll just show you some nice pictures from a presentation. And maybe this is kind of what the Burren is looking like in a few more weeks. So full of beautiful flowers. You can have a quiz here. The yellow one is the beautiful lady's bedstraw, and you can see the lovely purple crane's bills in the foreground as well. This is Park na Binne. David had a picture of it there a moment ago as well, the beautiful wedge tomb. And I love this picture because it shows the biodiversity, it shows the archaeology, and it shows the farming that takes place in the Burren. And I think it's those layers of history, natural history, and cultural heritage that really make the Burren so special. So I'm going to show a few pictures. Are you looking at farmer now? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is just a typical a picture from the other type of the year, part of the year. This is wintertime in the Burren, and this is a great farmer, Pat Nagel, farming in the Burren. So I'm going to show you a few pictures as we run through of, I suppose, the Burren at different times of the year. This is kind of wintertime as well, and you can see up in the hills some of the terrain that the cattle and the farmers deal with. Now this is quite rough. There's a limestone pavement that I know called Craig na Gower. It's the Craig of the goat, because it's so rough the cattle couldn't walk it. It only would take a goat or a very dexterous human to cross it. So you can see there's quite dramatic landscape up there in the hills sometimes. This is down below. This is Mullaghmore, of course, at Loch Gallon in the foreground. And David mentioned the folding of the landscape. And this is just such a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful place. Every time we go there, it's something different. And I suppose we should remember that maybe I think about 5% of the Burren is public land. And this is the heart of it, the Burren National Park. But the rest of the Burren is actually farmland, farmed by about 500 or 600 farm families. Here's a nice picture of what the Burren looks like just around now. This is Mullaghmore in the background, little spikes of the early purple orchids scattered around, and that little white carpet or dusting of the mountain avens, the Arctic alpine plant, you can see it. And the yellows then are that beautiful bird's foot trefoil that you'll find. And there's little dots of purple that some people might be able to see, and that's the little milkwort. So when you get out onto the Burren, there's just those beautiful colours this time of the year, and the closer you get to the ground, the more of them appear, different colours and different shapes. And here's a few people looking at the archaeological legacy of the Burren. This is Leman Fuca Biog, agus Leman Fuca Moor. And those people, that small group, are standing on an old Bronze Age burial site looking across at the landscape, which was created, I suppose, 300, 400 million years ago. A bit about the limestone, and of course those wonderful features, the erratics, these big boulders which have been rounded and dropped by the glaciers here many years ago. This is my favorite one of all time. This is an erratic. I took a picture of it about 20 years ago, and I loved it because it's almost like a natural sculpture of two people, one the taller and the other smaller person in the kind of like an embrace. But this is a beautiful, just a glacial rock boulder dropped in the Burren, and it naturally fractured and is separating over time. So they're moving slowly apart, the couple in the picture, and that beautiful erratic. This again is a picture of the Burren and the pine woodland in the East Burren, and this is kind of what it would have been like, as I said, for the first farmers in the Burren. And you can see without the woodland that very quickly once that woodland cover is removed and there was a downturn in climate that the skeleton of the burn became exposed. A few random pictures here. This is a picture infrared of the burn looking down, and this shows you the level of archaeology in the landscape, the amount of stone walls going back 6,000 years. There's layers upon layers of wall. The different colors there represent different types of vegetation. The dark red would be kind of the improved grasslands that we looked at before, and the blues would be the pavement. But you can see the amount of archaeology on the ground. And that's a message about the burn. It's geologically fascinating, archaeologically extraordinary, and ecologically then it's a real blessing. Moving quickly because I want to get to the flowers, but here's some of the stone walls that you'll find in the burn, which tell you a lot about the type of ground. The one on the top right is very fertile, deep ground, so the stones are more rounded, whereas on the left and the bottom, they're more taken from the pavement. Some of the walls here are spectacular. Then some of the walls go back 4,500, 5,000, 6,000 years. The one on the bottom left is a mound wall, and the other two are slab walls. And you can see they're very ancient features built by the first farmers in Ireland 6,000 years ago. And there is Palnebrone, of course, which is so famous they built the bouncy castle from it. There's little wedge tombs, like this one is up near Carron as well, quite discreet, as far from Palnebrone as you could get, but beautiful. And you can see the remains of the mound around it and the flowers as well. There's Fulloch Fias in the burn. This is a little kid's representation of the Fulloch Fia and what it's used for. Ring forts galore, castles, tower houses where Morrows live, lots of archaeology and history as well. And there's a lovely quote from John O'Donoghue about the fact that there's so much wonder and joy and mystery and knowledge in the land, but we're starting to lose it. So turf tiles and goat crows, these are other features in the burn. And if you want to know more about them, you'll have to listen to another talk of mine because I want to get onto the flowers. So we'll just move on to talk about a few of the flowers, given that it's Biodiversity Week this week. So I wanted to show you some of the flowers that you'll find here. Okay, just move through those couple and we'll look at some of the flowers now. Okay, so here we are. So I'm going to show you for maybe 15 minutes some of the flowers.
Sorry to interrupt you, Brendan. It looks like we do have David Cabot, just to say that, and maybe there can be a conversation. David, if you're able to pitch in with any comments, just to check if your audio is working.
I think he's either frozen or asleep, Pranjali. I think frozen. It's the most. Oh, and he's gone.
He's gone again. Okay. Well, I'll keep going with a few flowers until David comes back. So here's the mountain avens, carpets of it up at Slieve Carron, in bloom at the moment. And when you walk, especially up around Slieve Carron, and you really pay attention, you can find little flowers like the dense flowered orchid or the Irish orchid. And the lovely thing about it is that this is a Mediterranean plant, and you'll find it growing beside the Arctic mountain avens. And the burn is kind of unique in that regard, that you'll have the Arctic and the Mediterranean growing together. But the dense flowered orchid is just one of many orchids. This is the early purple, which is in flower at the moment. Sometimes it's not purple at all, it's white, as you can see on the right. The beautiful Bee Orchid, Dara, I was delighted to see Dara included because it's a perfect blend of bee and flower, but it's amazing. And when you get up close to it, you can see the textures, the velvety texture, and then the furry texture of the wings. It's just an amazing plant. And as Dara was saying, it's evolved to take that shape over many, many thousands of years, millions of years maybe. And it's the other orchid then, the beautiful fly orchid. This is another one on a rainy day, Dara. This is the beautiful fly orchid, a little slimmer than the Bee Orchid, but no less fascinating. You have the butterfly orchid, which has these really long spikes at the back of the florets. There's a nice bit of quaking grass in behind that one. You have the fragrant orchid, and you can see the burnet moths here having a good smell. You have the lovely Autumn's lady tresses, which is one of the special orchids of the burn, quite difficult to spot. You have the dark red helleborine, which is an orchid found on limestone pavement areas. You have this lovely Dactylorhiza flower, which is only found, I think, at one spot in the burn near Mullaghmore and right on the edge of the Turlough normally. But when I took this picture, it was in the Turlough. So that's quite a rare sight, a rare orchid in a very rare environment. Another favourite plant of mine and a real, has a stronghold on the burn is the thyme broomrape. It's very bright red. There's no green in it, so it doesn't photosynthesize. It actually steals its energy from a plant called wild thyme. So you'll find that those spikes across the burn. It's not an orchid, it's a very different parasitic plant called thyme broomrape. You'll have very rare plants. This is the pyramidal bugle. You'll find it over in Fenor. You'll have quite common plants in the burn which are rare enough elsewhere. And this, of course, is the beautiful geranium sanguineum, or the bloody cranesbill, which is one of the iconic plants of the burn, I guess, with the mountain avens and the gentian. You have its cousin then, the more common herb Robert, or stinking Robert, which is lovely because it's found flowering every month of the year in the burn. Even in the depths of winter, you'll find this little flower in bloom. Another nice thing about the burn is, and if you like photographs, it's not just taking pictures of rare flowers, but the color combinations. And this is the real, if you like Clare hurling or football, this is sort of very emblematic, because you have the Veronicas or the Speedwells along with the Buttercup trefoils in bloom. Again, this would be kind of May, June time of the year, but just beautiful, just really beautiful. And one of my favorite plants of all is the yellow rattle, Rhinanthus minor. And Burren Bio, I think, are hoping to organise an event for Heritage this week, where we're going to have a little initiative where we're going to share out some of the seeds of this yellow rattle so that people can grow a bit in their gardens. The thing about the yellow rattle, I remember talking to older farmers in the Burren, and they'd say that if you could tell a bad farmer if you listened carefully to when he was driving home with his crop of hay. So if you imagine years ago, the crop of hay, if there's a lot of yellow rattle in the hay, it kind of rattled as the cart moved along. And that was an indication that the field wasn't very well fertilized and was full of this plant called yellow rattle, because yellow rattle is a parasite. It'll knock back all the grasses in your meadow and make it a much poorer crop. But by knocking back the grasses and by parasitizing on them, it allows rarer plants like herbs and orchids to kind of flourish. So I have a field here from where I'm talking at the moment, and it's full of yellow rattle. And the farmer that cuts hay off it every year is going crazy because his crop is reducing every year. But that's the thing about nature conservation. Sometimes if you want a nice biodiverse meadow, sometimes you're going to have to sacrifice production to get that. So what we see in some cases as a field full of beautiful wildflowers, other people may see as a field full of weeds. But this is a very special plant. Like I said, look out for Heritage Week in the Burren, where we're going to be sharing out some of the wonderful seeds from this yellow rattle plant. Another special plant in the Burren is the wonderful, it's a wonderful little plant called Mountain Everlasting. It's just Antennaria diasica. It's also called cat's paw because it feels and looks like a cat's paw. It's got male and female. This is the female flower, nice and pink, and the male is nice and white. Gorgeous plant. Another plant, which is one of my very favorites. A lot of you recognize it. It's a late summer plant, July and August, and it grows on kind of wettish ground, and it's called Parnesia Palustris. And it's commonly known as the grass of Parnassus. But in terms of beauty, it's hard to rival this plant. It's got these beautiful translucent white leaves, 5 perfect leaves, and little, you can see little anthers as well, and filaments with them. It's just beautiful. The leaf is heart-shaped, and the stalk of the plant goes right through the heart, like an arrow through a heart. So it's a stunning plant. You have to wait until August, July, August before you'll see it. Another interesting plant, some of you will recognize this, is and it's coming to flower out now. This is butterwort, and we have 2 types of butterwort in the Burren: common butterwort and large flowered butterwort. Common butterwort, if you look at the base of the plant, has these leaves which are sticky and gluey because they're insectivorous. They'll trap insects and consume them as part of their diet because they grow on very nutrient poor ground. So they trap insects to feed themselves, these plants, just like the sundew plant. This plant is called Goldenrod. It doesn't look that fantastic, but it's a beautiful limestone plant. I put this in here, I think, because this is often mistaken for a very noxious plant called ragwort. And ragwort, for some farmers, gets them in a lot of trouble with the Department of Ag. And I know one farmer, at least, who was reported for having a field full of ragwort when actually he had a field full of goldenrod. And I know another farmer who spent about a day pulling what he thought was yellow rattle, and it was actually, when we met him, said, actually, no, that's goldenrod, leave it alone. So some plants can look quite alike in terms of the colours. Late summer, you have the beautiful harebell, fantastic little campanula plant, waving in the wind. As you can see, they used to call it witches' thimbles as well. It was like a little thimble-shaped or a little cup-shaped plant, protected by the little people. One of the most important plants in the Burren is this grass. It's Burren grass of fair Brenia, also known as Caesareria cariola, and it's called blue grass. It's a common name for it. And it's probably one of the first flowers in the Burren every year. Grasses are flowers as well, I guess, or they do flower. And it typically looks, what you see on the left there, it's metallic blue, purpley blue in colour. And it flowers around February, March, April every year. And when it flowers, it brings nutrients with it from the ground. So it provides a really important source of nutrition for cattle in late winter. So before the spring grass is ready, the cattle can munch away on this beautiful blue moor grass. And this kind of keeps them going through the hungry months of the winter. There's an albino head beside it there. So sometimes when you're taking pictures, you look for the unusual. But it's a stunning grass. And for farmers, it's hugely important. Another little grass, which is a favourite, I think, of many people, is Brisa media, quaking grass, also known as Ferragorta or famine grass. And this, they say, like the old farmers like Paddy Hines will always tell you about, when they were young, they were told that if they walked in this grass, they were walking where people died during the famine, and the hunger would come up from the ground and into their bellies, and they get a weakness called the Ferragorta. And I remember Paddy, who was a great Shanachie up in Karen, talking about getting the Ferragorta and having to go into the house to get a bit of a feed before he could make it home to his own place. So it's just such a beautiful plant, so beautiful, and such a strong history relating to it as well. And there's little tea rooms in Ballybohan called after the Ferragorta. And they say the cure against the Ferragorta was to carry a hazelnut in your pocket, and you'll be fine. I'll keep going for another couple of minutes, Brendan, if that's okay. Just to finish off, oh, I'm running ahead of myself. Fern.
There's plenty of interest, Brendan. Loads of comments saying keep going. They're loving being immersed in the flowers of the Burren. So yeah,
we'll run through it. So I remember when I was first in the Burren, I didn't know a grass from a flower, basically. So when I was trying to learn the flowers, a good place to start was the limestone pavement, because there's not so many flowers and they all repeat themselves. So very quickly you can learn to know one habitat inside out. So here's a nice picture of a piece of pavement. Now we've already seen the little herb Robert, little pink geranium plant. You can see it in there, and there's some sedges there on the right. And then you have 3 ferns, and these 3 ferns are found all over the Burren. This tiny little one here, it's called Walrue. It's a gorgeous little plant. If you turn the leaves over, you can see the black spores on the back of it. This one here then is called Rustyback, and again, if you turn it to the back, it's got these rust-coloured spores in the back of it. So it's a beautiful flower. And then you've got the heart tongue fern. Heart is another word for a deer, so it's like a deer's tongue, a long, narrow tongue. Some people call it the mother-in-law's tongue fern because it's long and sharp and pointed, like the mother-in-law's tongue. Here's some of the trees of the Burren, and the Burren has just these wonderful trees, and this is a whitethorn. But the lovely thing about this whitethorn is it's completely bent over. This is high on the hills of the Burren, so once the whitethorn grows above the shelter of the wall, the wind starts burning off the growth on the wind side, and it goes to the other side. So it's just amazing to stand under that, and even to stand back and look at it. It's like malleable, the tree, but that's a whitethorn, and you see a lot of trees like that up in the high Burren. They're all bent over, indicating the southwesterly direction of prevailing winds. And then we're lucky to have some amazing woodlands in the Burren. So here's a beautiful woodland near Slieve Carron. This would be one of the older pieces or fragments of woodland in the Burren, and it's very special in terms of its lichen communities. It's very special. It's just a very special place. It's got a wonderful sense within these woodlands, and these are a really important part of the Burren's ecology. And just beneath the trees, you can see the wild garlic, lots of wild garlic growing, a whole flush of it, and that's kind of coming to an end now, but it's been flowering for the last few weeks, the wild garlic in the woodland, but very beautiful and a very important part of the Atlantic hazel woodland is the term for it, and you can see some of the lichens that grow there. on the trees. Other trees that you'll find in the Burren, a favourite of mine is the spindle. Very common in the Burren. It's not quite a tree, it's more of a shrub, but this is the fruit of the spindle, and you can see the lovely coral pink or reddish colour of the fruit spindle right there. Last few flowers then, just to talk a little bit about, given that it's Biodiversity Week, like our connection with flora seems to be kind of diminishing over the years, but there was a time when we very much relied on plants for medicine and for food in many cases. A lovely example of that is the lady's bedstraw, which was used as a sleeping agent. So it's picked, dried out and stuffed into pillows, and it released a little chemical which is a relaxant and helps you to sleep at night. Beautiful flower all over the Burren. Another one very important for I suppose treating depression is Hypericum or St. John's wort. Stunning flower. There's about 10 different Hypericums in the Burren, and they're very important as a treatment for depression and for nervous disorders and things like that. If you're more interested in the cosmetic side of things, eye bright was used as a treatment for different eye ailments and was said to brighten the eye. Again, there's lots of different eye brights in the Burren, including quite a rare one called the Irish eye bright. Yarrow, I always remember being in the Burren many years ago, and an older farmer used to gather the leaves of yarrow and boil it in milk as a treatment against arthritis, rub it into the bones. Normally it's white, but you can see a lovely pink colour to this yarrow head. Linum, Catharticum, or fairy flax, Latin name Catharticum is Catharticum rather is cathartic. It's a purgatory plant. So if you had constipation, this is the little plant that you went to for your cure. It was quite cathartic, tiny little flower that you find in the Burren. Another one that I love, and it grows a lot in limestone pavements, is wood sage, Tucrum scordonia. And I'm not great on the Latin, so pardon the pronunciation. But that again was collected and sold in the Dublin markets in the 18th century. It was used as a cure against mortifications and gangrenes. That's according to Charles Nelson, who wrote a book about the flowers of the Burren. Wood sage. So if you're suffering from any mortifications or gangrenes at the moment, this is the plant that you wanted. Even the thistles in the Burren are very special. This is the beautiful golden Caroline thistle. It's a biennial, it grows over 2 years. And this is this in all its glory. You can see the lovely purple tinge to the flower as well, but this is used as a sweetmeat or a delicacy, cured with honey once upon a time, and used by the Emperor Charlemagne to cure his army of the plague back in the day. Wild thyme, you can see it here, but I suppose it's important to remember that, as Dara said earlier, that having that diversity of flora in the Burren and elsewhere is really important in terms of sustaining a broader biodiversity. And of course, anybody who's been to the Burren will recognise the little daytime flying moths here. They're called the transparent burnet moth, and they're a very special little daytime flying moth, very distinctive and very special. But of course, you'll find bees. And Dara, if you want to tell me what kind of bee this is on the scabious, you're welcome to, because I don't have a clue. But you can see lots of.
It's a male Bombus lapidarius, the red-tailed bumblebee, but it's a male.
Very good. So that's easy. It's good to have an expert on hand. But this is in the scabious, the field scabious in the autumn time. This is the 6-spot burnet moth. Sitting on a little, I think having a rest on a little bit of harebell right there. But the really wonderful moth that you'll find in the Burren as well is the Burren green moth. And I remember being in the Burren and hearing all about this moth from different people, but couldn't find it. Went out morning, noon and night to all the right places, couldn't find it. But I remember about 10 years ago, my little boy Oscar, he was about 4 or 5, came in one morning with this in his hand. He said, "Look, what's this thing on the door?" So he found accidentally what I've been seeking for 15 years. But the Burren will reveal its treasures if you're patient enough. But this is unique to the Burren, this subspecies. It's called the Burren green moth. This is a picture from my colleague Sharon Parr. Just beautiful, a beautiful colour. I don't even know how to describe that green, but it's very beautiful. And of course, the plants in the limestone provide food and shelter and calcium for the snails to build their shells. And there's just so many snails in the Burren. Those of us with polytunnel snails aren't very welcome, but when you're out on the Burren and you see the snails, they're spectacular. I think there's about 60 different species of snail in the landscape. And lizards, very common in the Burren. Even at night time when you're walking, you'll see lizards on the road here in the Burren. And we have even a quite rare lizard called the slow worm, which is a legless lizard found in the Burren as well. So that's pretty much my celebration of biodiversity of the Burren. Just some of the flowers and some of the animals that depend on them and some of the connections we have with them. So I kind of say in summary that I'm privileged to live in the Burren, and any day I go out, the transformation that you see in the pastures and the meadows of the Burren is spectacular. And if you get a nice sunny day in the Burren, the smells and the sounds and the sights and the shapes and the colors, it's just fantastic. And we're very lucky to have it as a repository of wildlife. And hopefully, even though we're in a biodiversity crisis in Ireland right now, we can see more biodiversity returning to our grasslands and pastures across Ireland in the future years. So hopefully, some of you get down here to see it in real life in the Burren before the summer is over.